I said the wrong words, and now I'm engaged to an alien queen. John Harper had always considered himself careful with words. As a linguist and xenocultural researcher, he knew that one wrong phrase could spark confusion, or worse, on an alien planet. Yet, despite all his preparation, nothing could have prepared him for the disaster that awaited him on Zyphera. Zyphera was nothing like Earth. Its skies shimmered in shades of violet and silver, and the ground beneath John's feet glowed faintly as if the planet itself pulsed with life. Towering crystalline structures rose from the landscape, refracting the light in rainbow patterns. The Illyrians, Zyphera's dominant species, were taller than humans, with smooth, pale skin that shifted in hue depending on their mood. Their eyes were large and reflective, giving them an almost ethereal appearance. John had read everything about them, yet nothing could prepare him for the experience of meeting them in person. The reason for his visit was a diplomatic mission. Humans had finally established contact with Zyphera, and John's expertise in language and culture had made him the ideal candidate to serve as a mediator. The Illyrians communicated through a complex mix of sounds, gestures, and subtle word choices. Misinterpret even one syllable, and the meaning could change entirely. John had spent months memorizing phrases, practicing tone modulation, and learning the smallest gestures. He had to be perfect. He arrived at the palace for the diplomatic banquet, his stomach twisting in knots. The Illyrians had requested a formal gathering to honor the human visitor, and John had been warned repeatedly that every word, every gesture would be under scrutiny. He entered the grand hall and his breath caught. The palace was enormous, a cathedral of light and color. Transparent walkways floated above pools of luminescent liquid, and the ceiling seemed to stretch into infinity, decorated with slowly moving constellations. Illyrians glided gracefully across the hall, their movements like a silent dance. And then there was her, Queen Lyrissa. She stood at the center of the hall, a figure of elegance and authority. Her skin shimmered in gentle waves of silver and lavender, and her eyes, enormous and dark, seemed to look straight into John's soul. She wore a ceremonial robe that caught the light, making it appear as though stars were woven into the fabric. John's carefully rehearsed phrases scattered in his mind like leaves in the wind. The Illyrians welcomed him with nods and soft, melodic tones that his translator headset rendered into English. "We are honored by your presence, John Harper of Earth," it said. John bowed deeply, trying to imitate the Illyrian's fluid movements. His translator repeated his phrase back in Illyrian, and for a moment, everything seemed to go smoothly. Then came the moment of disaster. John had wanted to compliment Queen Lyrissa on her wisdom and grace. In Illyrian, the words for respectful admiration and eternal partnership were almost identical, differing only in a subtle tonal shift. John, nervous and eager to impress, chose the wrong tone. "I offer my lifelong bond," he said, believing he was speaking a polite compliment. The words left his mouth with a trembling certainty, and then silence fell over the hall. The Illyrians froze mid-motion. Their eyes widened slightly, a color shift signaling surprise. Queen Lyrissa tilted her head, her gaze sharp yet calm. The translator repeated his phrase, and John realized too late what he had said. A lifelong bond. That was not a compliment, that was a proposal. John's heart sank. He opened his mouth to correct himself, but the Illyrians' customs were strict. Once spoken, words carried weight. Honesty and courage were prized above all else, and retracting a statement was considered cowardice. He had just declared himself the Queen's intended, and there was no turning back. The room erupted in murmurs, the soft musical tones of Illyrian conversation filling the air with tension. John felt every pair of eyes on him, and he wished he could disappear into the glowing floor. Queen Lyrissa stepped forward, her gaze fixed on him. "Your words are clear," she said, her voice melodic and even. "Do you intend what you have spoken?" John swallowed hard. "And no, I mean, yes, I mean," he stopped. He had no way to explain the mistake without offending her. Every instinct told him to apologize, to clarify, but the Illyrians valued directness above all. Hesitation might be worse than the mistake itself. "You have courage," the queen said. "To speak so openly before all without fear is admirable. Your words are accepted." Accepted. John felt his knees weaken. Accepted. As in he was engaged. Before he could process the implications, an Illyrian aide approached and gestured for him to follow. "To the palace," the aide said in calm tones. John had no choice but to obey. The journey to the royal chambers was disorienting. The palace corridors twisted and shifted, reflecting light in strange ways, and Illyrian architecture seemed almost alive. John tried to keep his mind focused, repeating phrases in Illyrian that might explain the misunderstanding, but every sentence sounded worse than the last. Finally, he arrived at the queen's chambers. The room was vast, circular, and bathed in soft, flowing light. The walls were translucent, showing the twinkling surface of Scifi outside. Queen Lyrissa stood at the center, calm and regal. "You will stay here," she said. "For observation, for learning. Your role is not yet fully defined, but your words have set a course. You will follow the customs of our people." John nodded mutely. Observation, learning, customs. The words sounded harmless, but he knew the reality was far more complicated. He was now living as the accidental fiancé of an alien queen. Over the following days, John attempted to adjust to palace life. Every meal, every interaction, every tone of speech had consequences. He learned quickly that the Illyrians judged not just words, but the intention behind them. A wrong gesture could be insulting. A misused word could be binding. He found himself under the watchful eyes of advisors and officials, all curious about the human who had so boldly and mistakenly spoken of lifelong partnership. Some were skeptical, others amused, but all recognized that his actions could have serious political implications. Queen Lyrissa, for her part, was patient. She observed John closely, offering subtle guidance rather than overt correction. She challenged him to participate in rituals, to speak in Illyrian tone patterns, and to learn their philosophy of interconnectedness and respect. Each day was a lesson in humility and perseverance. Despite the fear and embarrassment, John began to notice something unexpected. The queen was not the intimidating figure he had imagined. She was intelligent, curious, and surprisingly approachable. She asked questions about Earth, about humanity, and about John's life. She was interested in his thoughts, his mistakes, and even his misunderstandings. John, in turn, began to appreciate her wisdom. He saw how deeply the Illyrians valued honesty, courage, and cultural understanding. What had seemed like a nightmare, a mistaken proposal, was revealing a world far richer and more complex than he had imagined. Still, he could not ignore the reality of his situation. The words he had spoken were binding in Illyrian culture. There was no going back without causing offense or diplomatic scandal. He had to navigate this delicate new reality with care, learning to survive, and perhaps even thrive, in the world he had accidentally entered. As he lay in the palace quarters that night, gazing out at Scifi's glowing landscape, John realized that his life had changed in ways he could never have predicted. A simple mistake in language had thrown him into an adventure beyond his wildest imagination. He was frightened, yes, but also strangely exhilarated. One wrong phrase, one accidental proposal, one alien queen. And yet, despite it all, John Harper felt the first stirring of curiosity and courage that would define the journey ahead. He knew the days to come would test him, challenge him, and perhaps even transform him. And in that moment, staring at the swirling violet skies, he understood that sometimes the greatest journeys began with the smallest mistakes. Life in the palace was unlike anything John Harper had imagined. Every morning, he woke to the soft hum of the glowing chambers, the walls shifting in color and pattern with the rising Zephyrin sun. The Illyrians moved around him with elegance and quiet purpose, their eyes flicking to him in curiosity, suspicion, or approval. He had become an observer and participant at the same time, a human living in a world that operated on rules both familiar and alien. Queen Lyrissa had established a routine for him, though she never made it feel rigid. He was to spend time learning the language properly, practicing the tones and gestures that could mean the difference between praise and insult. He was to understand the Illyrian philosophy of interconnectedness, the belief that all actions, words, and intentions rippled through the community, affecting everyone. And most importantly, he was to engage with her directly, under the careful guidance of her advisors, as part of his accidental commitment. At first, John struggled with the simplest things. A wrong tilt of his head during greeting could suggest dishonor. Mispronouncing even a single note in the musical tones of Illyrian speech might seem like defiance. One day, during a lesson in the palace gardens, he attempted a respectful bow while speaking a phrase intended to show gratitude. The translator rendered it correctly, but the queen's eyes narrowed slightly, a ripple of silver running across her skin. "You have not yet mastered the subtleties," Lyrissa said softly. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Words carry intention. Your intention was good, but the form must reflect the meaning." John nodded, feeling both chastened and determined. He spent hours repeating phrases, practicing tone and gesture. Slowly, he began to see progress. His words became smoother, his motions more natural. The queen watched him with quiet interest, correcting him only when necessary and often praising small victories. It was during these lessons that John began to understand her. Lyrissa was more than a ruler. She was a student of life itself. She asked questions about Earth, about human history, about the choices that shaped him. She wanted to know how humans thought, how they felt, and how they interacted with one another. And she listened, truly listened. One afternoon, as they walked through the palace's floating gardens, John found himself asking about the Illyrian customs that had confused him the most. "Why is it that one wrong word can cause so much change?" he asked. Lyrissa smiled, the light catching in her eyes. "Words are not just symbols, they are actions. When you speak, you commit yourself. You cannot separate thought from deed." John considered this. On Earth, words could be taken back or misunderstood or simply ignored. But here, each word was a promise, a step on a path that could not be undone. He realized that his accidental proposal had not just been a mistake, it had been an irreversible act that demanded understanding, courage, and adaptation. As the days passed, John's interactions with the Queen became less formal. They shared stories of their worlds, laughed at misunderstandings, and debated ideas with careful respect. John discovered that the Illyrians had a deep appreciation for creativity and problem-solving. Lyrissa asked him about human inventions, about the ways humans solved problems that the Illyrians approached differently. In return, she showed him Illyrian methods of diplomacy, subtle negotiation, and cultural rituals that had endured for centuries. But palace life was not without tension. John began to notice subtle glances, quiet conversations, and barely concealed whispers among the advisors and officials. Some Illyrians were skeptical of his presence. A human engagement to the Queen was unprecedented, and while some saw opportunity, others feared disruption. John could feel the scrutiny, the silent measuring of his worth and loyalty. He realized that he had to prove himself, not just in language and etiquette, but in courage, intelligence, and integrity. The first real test came when a delegation of Illyrians from a distant region arrived at the palace. They had not seen John before and did not understand the circumstances of his engagement. During the formal introductions, John tried his best to speak properly, using the lessons he had learned. His tone, gesture, and phrasing were correct, but the delegation remained skeptical. "You claim a bond with the Queen," one of the delegates said, her voice sharp and musical. "Are you worthy of such a connection? Do you understand our people, our ways?" John swallowed hard. He could not lie. "I am learning," he said honestly. "I do not yet fully understand, but I am committed to learning and respecting your ways." The Queen watched him carefully, her eyes reflecting approval. To John's surprise, the delegation murmured among themselves and then nodded. His honesty and willingness to adapt had impressed them. It was a small victory, but in the world of Sci-Fi, such victories mattered greatly. Beyond formal challenges, John faced personal adjustments. Illyrian food, for example, was an entirely new experience. Meals consisted of bioluminescent fruits, nutrient-rich liquids, and textures that shifted when chewed. At first, John struggled, often choking or grimacing at unfamiliar flavors. Lyrissa observed silently and then offered guidance, demonstrating the proper way to taste and appreciate each element. "Eating is not just for nourishment," she explained. "It is a ritual of respect and harmony." John began to understand the layers of meaning in every Illyrian custom. Walking through the palace halls, he noticed the flow of energy, the placement of light, the subtle signals in gestures and tone. Every action carried significance, and his awareness of these nuances grew. By observing, learning, and participating, he gradually became more integrated into the daily rhythm of the palace. One evening, as they watched Zyphera's twin moons rise over the crystalline horizon, John reflected on his journey so far. What had begun as a mistake, a single wrong phrase, had opened the door to a world of beauty, intelligence, and complexity beyond anything he had known. He realized that the challenge was not just learning a new language or understanding customs. It was learning to see the world differently, to appreciate the depth of meaning in actions, words, and connections. Yet, even as he grew more comfortable, John could not ignore the underlying tension. Rival factions within the Illyrian court still watched him closely, their intentions unclear. He knew that at any moment, a misstep could escalate into a serious political problem. Every interaction with the Queen, every engagement with officials, required careful thought, humility, and courage. It was during one of these moments of quiet reflection that John discovered something unexpected. He was beginning to genuinely admire Lyrissa. Her wisdom, curiosity, and fairness were remarkable, and he found himself drawn to her personality and intellect. What had begun as a mistake, the accidental proposal, was transforming into a relationship built on respect and mutual learning. He had never anticipated this, and yet he could not deny the feeling growing within him. One day, a minor crisis tested his newfound understanding. A ceremonial artifact, essential to a palace ritual, had been misplaced. The Illyrian officials were distressed, unsure how to proceed, and the ritual could not be delayed. John observed the situation carefully and realized that the human way of thinking, practical, inventive, and direct, could solve the problem. He suggested a solution, combining human logic with the Illyrian principles of respect and harmony. To his relief, the Queen approved. The artifact was retrieved, the ritual continued smoothly, and the officials expressed quiet admiration for his ingenuity. John felt a surge of confidence. For the first time, he realized that he was not just surviving in this world, he was contributing meaningfully. As the days turned into weeks, John's confidence grew. He spoke more fluently, moved more gracefully, and understood the subtle rhythms of Illyrian life. He continued to make mistakes, small ones, but each mistake was a lesson, each lesson a step toward deeper understanding. The accidental engagement that had once terrified him now felt like an opportunity, a path that challenged him to become more than he had ever imagined. And through it all, Lyrissa remained a guiding presence. She did not coddle him, nor did she mock him. She observed, instructed, and sometimes challenged him in ways that were subtle but profound. John began to see that their bond, accidental as it had been, was evolving into something genuine. Respect, trust, and curiosity were forming a foundation stronger than he could have predicted. As he prepared for another day of lessons, John realized that he had come a long way since his first disastrous words. He had entered the palace as a frightened human, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of alien culture. Now, he was beginning to understand, adapt, and even influence the world around him. The palace, once a place of fear and confusion, had become a space of growth, learning, and unexpected discovery. And though he knew challenges still awaited, political tension, cultural misunderstandings, and the unpredictable nature of diplomacy, John Harper felt ready. He had survived the initial chaos of his accidental engagement and had begun to find his place. The journey was far from over, but he had learned an invaluable lesson. Courage, honesty, and openness could turn mistakes into opportunities, and even the most frightening errors could lead to profound growth. As the twin moons of Sci-Fi rose again over the palace, John looked toward the queen's chambers and saw Lyrissa observing him from afar. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, no words were needed. Understanding, respect, and perhaps the beginnings of friendship, or something more, passed silently between them. John smiled, knowing that he was no longer merely the human who had spoken the wrong words. He was a participant in a world of wonder, a learner in a culture both alien and extraordinary, and a partner, albeit an accidental one, to a remarkable queen. The palace hummed softly around him, alive with light, movement, and the pulse of Xipheran life. John Harper was ready for whatever came next. John Harper's days in the palace had grown steadier, but peace was fragile. The accidental engagement that had thrown him into Illyrian life also put him in the middle of a delicate web of political intrigue. The Queen's court was not a place of open hostility, but whispers carried far, and rival factions were quick to seize any hint of weakness. John was learning that surviving in Xiphora's palace required more than polite words and careful gestures. It required strategy, awareness, and courage. One morning, as John practiced Illyrian tone exercises in the palace gardens, an aide approached him with an urgent expression. "John Harper," the aide said, his voice a musical trill, "you are requested in the council chamber. The Dravos delegation has arrived, and the Queen wishes you to observe their discussions." John felt a surge of unease. Dravos was a neighboring planet, known for its aggressive diplomacy and subtle threats. They had monitored the human-Illyrian relationship closely, and John's accidental engagement might be seen as a weakness to exploit. His heart pounded as he followed the aide through twisting corridors of light and crystal, trying to steady his nerves. The council chamber was vast, circular, and echoing, with floating platforms where delegates hovered rather than sat. Dravosian ambassadors glared at him with sharp eyes, and Illyrian officials moved around them like dancers, their movements deliberate and graceful. At the center, Queen Lyrissa presided, her presence commanding yet calm. She glanced at John, her gaze encouraging. "Observe carefully," she said softly. "Your perspective is valuable." John nodded, though he felt far from valuable. The Dravosians spoke quickly, their words harsh and clipped, their gestures precise. They questioned Illyrian decisions, probed alliances, and suggested compromises that would weaken Xiphora's position. John realized that if he stayed silent, the Queen might appear isolated, and the Dravosians would take advantage. He took a deep breath. Drawing on everything he had learned, the language, the philosophy, the subtle cues of Illyrian culture, he prepared to intervene. His voice was steady, his tone respectful but firm. "If I may," he began, "I believe there is a solution that honors both Xipheran traditions and Dravosian concerns." Heads turned, both Illyrian and Dravosian, and a hush fell over the chamber. John outlined a compromise that combined human logic with Illyrian principles of harmony. He suggested a series of joint councils, shared cultural exchanges, and a plan for resource distribution that maintained fairness while addressing Dravosian demands. The room was silent for a moment. Then, Queen Lyrissa nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Your insight is appreciated," she said. "You have thought carefully and respectfully." The Dravosian ambassador's expression was hard to read, but the suggestion could not be dismissed outright. The compromise was practical, elegant, and culturally sensitive. John had surprised even himself. He had turned observation into action, and action into influence. After the council session, John retreated to the gardens, where Lyrissa joined him. "You handled that well," she said, her skin shimmering in soft silver. "You are learning not only our ways but how to integrate your perspective. That is rare among outsiders." John felt a mix of relief and pride. "I was afraid I would say the wrong thing," he admitted. "Or do the wrong thing." Lyrissa smiled gently. "Mistakes are part of learning. Courage is knowing when to speak despite fear. You have courage, John. That is why you were accepted. That is why you will continue to be tested, and why you will continue to grow." The political threat was only the beginning. In the following days, John noticed signs of tension within the Illyrian court itself. Certain officials and nobles seemed uneasy about his growing influence. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few whispered about human interference. John realized that navigating this world required more than cultural understanding. It required careful diplomacy and strategic thinking. One afternoon, he was summoned to assist in a delicate negotiation between two Illyrian factions. A disagreement over resource allocation had escalated, and the Queen wanted John to offer an outsider's perspective. As he entered the chamber, he studied the representatives carefully. Their gestures were sharp, their eyes wary. John knew that the key was not just what he said, but how he said it. He began by acknowledging each faction's concerns, using Illyrian tone patterns to convey respect and neutrality. Then he suggested a creative solution, combining practical reasoning with the Illyrian value of harmony. The factions paused, their expressions softening. Slowly, they began to see the proposal's merit. By the end of the session, the dispute was resolved amicably, and John received subtle nods of approval. His confidence grew with each success, but he remained aware of the stakes. One misstep could unravel his progress and endanger not only his position, but also the fragile alliances between humans and Illyrians. He practiced mindfulness, careful observation, and patience, learning that influence was earned through trust, respect, and thoughtful action. During quieter moments, John spent time with Queen Lyrissa, learning more about her world and her people. They explored the palace's floating gardens, walked along crystal walkways that stretched over glowing pools, and observed the behavior of Zyphera's unique wildlife. Lyrissa shared stories of her ancestors, the principles that guided Illyrian society, and the ways in which their culture had survived countless challenges. John listened intently, absorbing knowledge and deepening his understanding of the world he now inhabited. Through these experiences, John's admiration for the Queen grew. She was wise, patient, and curious, but also capable of decisive action when necessary. He realized that the accidental engagement had brought him into contact with someone truly extraordinary. Despite the initial panic and embarrassment, he began to see the engagement not as a mistake, but as an opportunity to learn, contribute, and grow. One evening, an unexpected challenge tested both John and Lyrissa. A minor civil dispute erupted in a distant region of Zyphera, threatening to destabilize local governance. Reports arrived that factions were preparing to act independently, and the Queen needed a strategy to maintain harmony without appearing authoritarian. John offered a plan. Drawing on his human understanding of organization and communication, combined with Illyrian cultural principles. He suggested a series of mediated discussions, resource-sharing agreements, and joint oversight councils. The Queen approved, and John was entrusted with overseeing the implementation. It was a tense week. John coordinated with Illyrian officials, traveled across the region, and mediated disputes with patience and careful judgment. He learned to read the subtleties of Illyrian emotion, to detect when tone or gesture indicated hidden concern or intent. Each interaction required focus, diplomacy, and empathy. By the end of the week, the situation was resolved. Factions agreed to the proposed plan, conflicts subsided, and local governance stabilized. Illyrian officials quietly praised John's role, recognizing the value of his perspective and his dedication to understanding their culture. For John, the experience was transformative. He had moved from accidental participant to active contributor, proving that even an outsider could make a meaningful difference. Through these challenges, John and Lyrisa's bond strengthened. They spent long evenings discussing strategy, culture, and philosophy. John shared human problem-solving methods, while Lyrissa offered insights into Illyrian diplomacy and societal values. Mutual respect blossomed, and a quiet trust grew between them. The accidental engagement, once a source of fear, had evolved into a partnership based on collaboration, understanding, and shared purpose. However, John never forgot the delicate nature of his position. Rival factions still watched him, Dravosian interests lingered in the background, and every decision had potential consequences. He remained vigilant, aware that his success depended on constant attention to detail, cultural sensitivity, and strategic thinking. As he stood in the palace gardens one evening, watching the twin moons rise over Zyphera's crystalline landscape, John reflected on the journey so far. He had arrived as a linguist, unprepared for the accidental engagement that had thrown his life into chaos. He had faced embarrassment, confusion, and political uncertainty. Yet through learning, courage, and careful observation, he had begun to find his place. He was no longer merely a visitor. He was a participant, a mediator, and a partner to the Queen. John knew the challenges ahead would be even greater. Larger political threats loomed, cultural misunderstandings could still occur, and he would need to continue adapting to Illyrian life. But he also knew that he had grown in ways he could not have imagined. Mistakes had become lessons, lessons had become opportunities, and opportunity had become confidence. When Lyrissa joined him in the garden, her presence calm and reassuring, John felt a sense of purpose he had never known. Together, they discussed strategies, shared observations, and planned for the future. Their partnership, once accidental, had become intentional, rooted in respect, understanding, and a shared commitment to the well-being of Zyphera and its people. As night settled over the palace, John realized that he was no longer the frightened human who had spoken the wrong words. He had become someone capable of navigating complex challenges, bridging cultures, and earning the trust of those around him. The accidental engagement had been a turning point, a challenge that had tested his courage, intelligence, and adaptability. And as he looked toward the Queen, he felt ready for whatever trials awaited, confident that he could face them with wisdom, honesty, and a growing sense of partnership. John Harper had survived the first waves of uncertainty. He had proved himself in the palace, in council chambers, and in regions far from the capital. He had learned to speak and act with intention, to respect and understand a culture profoundly different from his own, and to navigate the delicate currents of political intrigue. Most importantly, he had begun to see the value in his accidental engagement, not as a trap, but as a journey of growth, understanding, and connection. And as the palace shimmered in the soft light of Zyphera's twin moons, John knew that the greatest challenges were still ahead, but so were the greatest opportunities. He had become more than a visitor. He had become a part of a world that had once seemed impossible, and a partner to a queen whose wisdom, curiosity, and strength inspired him every day. Tension had been building quietly for weeks, and now it reached a tipping point. The Dravosian delegation, dissatisfied with Zyphera's growing alliance with humans, had escalated from diplomatic pressure to a subtle threat of military action. Rumors of fleet movements and covert operations spread through the palace corridors like wildfire. John Harper, who had learned to read not only words but the silences and glances of the Illyrians, sensed the urgency immediately. Queen Lyrissa called a council meeting in the heart of the palace. Delegates from all regions of Zyphera were present, floating on their platforms with careful precision. The queen's voice resonated through the chamber, calm but firm. Dravos has tested our patience. We must respond with wisdom and strength. Human counsel has been invaluable, John Harper, and we seek your advice once again. John's stomach tightened. The stakes were higher than ever. Failure was no longer embarrassing or awkward. It could cost lives and destabilize the planet. He took a deep breath, gathering every lesson he had learned since his accidental engagement. Observing the Dravosian movements, analyzing Illyrian customs, and recalling human strategies, he began to formulate a plan. The Dravosians seek to intimidate us, he said, carefully modulating his voice and tone. We should respond with a combination of diplomacy and demonstration of strength. A joint defense exercise, open to their observation, will show them that Zyphera is united and prepared. At the same time, a series of strategic communications can emphasize our commitment to peace and mutual respect. The chamber was silent for a moment, the delegates processing his words. Lyrissa's eyes glimmered with approval. Your logic is sound, she said. We will proceed as you advise. Preparation for the demonstration was intense. John worked with Illyrian officials to coordinate fleet maneuvers, communication protocols, and ceremonial displays of cooperation between humans and Zypherians. He learned to anticipate the Dravosian reactions, predicting not only how they would perceive strength but also how they would respond to subtle signs of unity. Every action had to convey balance, power without aggression, preparedness without provocation. The day of the demonstration arrived. Fleets of ships glided through Zyphera's skies in perfect synchronization, their lights reflecting in the crystalline towers below. John observed from the palace balcony, alongside Queen Lyrissa, noting the expressions of both allies and Dravosian observers. The Dravosians' sharp eyes watched intently, but there was no doubt in John's mind that they had been impressed. After the exercise, a diplomatic session was held. John spoke with calm authority, using Illyrian and human communication methods to negotiate a temporary truce and establish clear boundaries. His combination of logic, cultural sensitivity, and creative thinking won the respect of the Dravosians. By the end of the day, the immediate threat had been neutralized without bloodshed, and Zyphera remained secure. The relief in the palace was palpable. Illyrian officials praised John quietly, acknowledging his contributions in a culture where public accolades were rare. Queen Lyrissa approached him, her expression serene but proud. You have done more than survive, she said. You have strengthened our people and our alliances. You have proven that courage, thoughtfulness, and understanding can overcome even the gravest challenges. John felt a swell of pride, but also humility. He thought back to the banquet, to the accidental words that had begun this journey. If he had not spoken without knowing, he would never have experienced the growth, the challenges, and the connections that had shaped the last weeks. What had seemed a catastrophe had become a catalyst for transformation. Even with the immediate threat resolved, palace life continued to test him in new ways. Rival factions, though subdued, remained watchful. Cultural ceremonies and rituals demanded precision and awareness. John continued to study the Illyrian language, refine his gestures, and understand the deeper philosophies behind every custom. He had learned that mastery was not about perfection. It was about continuous adaptation, observation, and respect. Amid these challenges, John's relationship with Queen Lyrissa deepened. They spent time discussing not only political matters but philosophy, ethics, and culture. He shared stories of Earth, the complexities of human society, and how humans learned from mistakes. She, in turn, shared Zyphera's history, the importance of interconnectedness, and how their society balanced individuality with community. The bond between them, once accidental, had grown into mutual trust and friendship, with hints of something more profound quietly emerging. One evening, after a long day of meetings, John walked with Lyrissa through the palace gardens. The glowing flora cast soft reflections on their faces, and the twin moons rose above the crystalline horizon. Silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the faint hum of Zyphera's life. "You have adapted remarkably well," Lyrissa said, her voice soft. "I have seen humans before, but rarely one who can so quickly integrate into our culture, think creatively, and act with both respect and courage." John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I didn't know if I could manage it at first. Everything was so overwhelming. But you taught me to observe, to understand, to act carefully, and you gave me the freedom to contribute. I've learned more than I ever expected." Lyrissa's eyes glimmered with silver and violet. "Your journey has been unexpected for both of us," she said. "But sometimes the greatest growth comes from the most unforeseen circumstances." As the weeks passed, John continued to take on responsibilities in the palace and across Zyphera. He mediated disputes, advised on diplomatic missions, and participated in cultural events. Each experience reinforced his understanding of Illyrian society and strengthened the alliance between humans and Zypherians. What had started as a personal mistake had evolved into a role of significance and impact. Then came the day of the formal confirmation. The Illyrians had a ceremony to acknowledge bonds of partnership, not only as a personal commitment, but as a symbol of trust and cooperation between species. John knew that this moment would mark the culmination of his journey from accidental fiancé to trusted partner. He approached the palace hall with a mixture of nervousness and resolve. The hall was alive with Illyrian light and movement. Delegates from all regions as well as human observers gathered to witness the ceremony. Queen Lyrissa stood at the center, serene and radiant. John stepped forward, aware of every gesture, tone, and movement. He spoke clearly, with intention and respect, expressing his willingness to honor the bond, to learn, and to contribute to the well-being of Zyphera. The ceremony proceeded with grace and beauty, reflecting the values of the Illyrian people. John participated fully, demonstrating his understanding, courage, and respect. By the end, he was no longer merely an accidental fiancé. He had become a true partner, recognized not only by Lyrissa but by the people of Zyphera. After the ceremony, the Queen and John walked through the gardens, the glow of the flora and twin moons painting the landscape in silver and violet light. John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that began with a single mistaken phrase had transformed his life completely. He had faced embarrassment, danger, and political tension, yet he had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable. "You have exceeded my expectations," Lyrissa said softly, her hand brushing briefly against his. "Not because of the words you spoke, but because of the actions you took afterward. Courage, honesty, and perseverance define true partnership." John nodded, feeling a profound respect and admiration for her. "I never imagined it would turn out like this," he admitted. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything. I've learned so much and I've met someone extraordinary." Lyrissa's eyes reflected a quiet warmth. "And you have shown that even mistakes can lead to remarkable journeys. Sometimes the wrong words open doors that the right words could never reach." As they stood together in the glowing gardens, John felt a sense of completion and anticipation at the same time. The challenges of the past weeks had tested him, transformed him, and connected him to a world far beyond his own. He had begun as a human visitor, fearful and uncertain. Now he was a partner to a queen, a trusted member of Zyphera's society, and a bridge between worlds. The palace hummed softly around them, alive with light, music, and movement. John realized that the adventure was not truly ending, it was evolving. New challenges would arise, new diplomatic missions would call, and the partnership he had forged with Lyrissa would continue to grow. Yet he knew that he was ready. He had learned to adapt, to think, to act, and to respect. He had discovered that courage, honesty, and empathy could overcome the most daunting obstacles. For the first time, John Harper felt at home, not just on Zyphera, but in a life filled with purpose, partnership, and possibility. What had started as a single mistake had become an extraordinary journey, one that reshaped not only his life but the future of two worlds. And as he walked alongside Queen Lyrissa, the accidental engagement now a foundation for trust, respect, and shared ambition, he understood that the right path sometimes begins with the wrong words. And under the twin moons of Zyphera, with the palace glowing softly around them, John Harper knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be.